Our reading is from the Gospel of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and your sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. That's sometimes translated, be whole, therefore, as your heavenly Father is whole or complete. Here, don't all lives matter? In this 6th year of this country's first experience with a black president, it has become crystal clear that the problem of racism still haunts the national psyche. 2 years ago, a Florida jury acquitted George Zimmerman of the murder of Trayvon Martin. A year ago, on July 17, 2014, a Staten Island police killed Eric Garner with a chokehold. On August 9, 2014, in Ferguson, Missouri, Michael Brown was shot and killed by a policeman. On November 22, 2014, police in Cleveland, Ohio, shot and killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice. On April 4, 2015, a white North Charleston, South Carolina police officer killed Walter Scott, a 50-year-old African-American man, after a traffic stop. On April 12, 2015, Freddie Gray, a 25-year-old African-American man, went into a coma while being transported in a police van and died several days later. Each of these police incidents of the last year have resulted in massive protests at each stage of the proceedings. At the time of the Zimmerman verdict, 3 African-American women started a campaign on social media called Black Lives Matter, or hashtag Black Lives Matter. And that, more than any other phrase, has become the rallying cry for the protests within the last year. This phrase has rankled some people, and that's why I titled this sermon, Don't All Lives Matter? It's a natural enough question in the abstract. As I said last week, Lincoln said our nation was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. If we are all created equal, then all lives matter. Yes, true. Our Universalist and Christian heritages teach us that all are children of God. God makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. But all lives matter is not what needs saying at this time. What needs saying at this time is that all people, all Americans, black, white, yellow, brown, need to insist that our justice system value black lives as much as any other. And the reason it needs saying is that this proposition has been called into question by the facts in these cases. Racism is a big no-no in our society, and so people rarely admit to racist motivations. The courts have long held that racial discrimination can be proven by circumstantial evidence in the form of statistics. If a company is located in a region that has a 25% black workforce, but the company has a workforce that is only 1% black, this may be considered as evidence of discrimination. But what happens when you have a nationwide series of incidents whose only common element is that they are chosen by the news media out of the thousands of incidents of police-citizen violence that happen every year? Is it fair to say this is evidence of a pattern? Blacks and whites will view that question differently. For the question may be abstract to whites. For blacks, it's a matter of life and death, of basic personal safety or security. People of goodwill have been calling for years for a national conversation on race. But I think the events of this last year have shown just how difficult that conversation can be. Here on Cape Cod, the events in Ferguson gave rise not only to protests, but to a forum at Cape Cod Community College in December. Elenita Muniz, the coordinator of the Barnstable County Human Rights Commission, was one of the panelists. As a white-skinned person of Hispanic heritage, she had a special perspective on race, and she gave a nuanced version of that perspective, but what showed up in the news report was her statement that all white people are racist. This precipitated a firestorm in the letters to the editor and on talk radio and calls for Elenita's firing or resignation. What this illustrated is that any conversation about race in public between the races has to deal with what has been called white fragility, a strong sensitivity on the part of many whites to any suggestion that they themselves are racist. Everyone knows that racist is a bad thing, and nobody wants to be called a bad thing in public. On the other hand, white denial of racism just makes the problem worse, because the people who have the power to do something about it don't recognize it as a problem. In order to accept responsibility for a problem, you have to acknowledge that a problem exists. Hence, much published black opinion expresses frustration with the myriad ways whites have devised to avoid dealing with racism. If one actually reads what Elenita said last December, she noted that she had taken a test for latent racism, and it was very enlightening. I took that same test. I don't say I'm not a racist. I don't say I'm not a racist. I have devoted a considerable part of the energy of my life to combating racism, out there and in here. But I don't claim to be 100% free of it in my heart of hearts. It is a work in progress. Now, I spent 20 happy years practicing law in Charleston, South Carolina. Racism in the justice system was an everyday reality. A lawyer had to recognize it and deal with it, or else he wasn't representing his clients properly. It was a fact of life, and it came particularly to the fore in criminal cases and police misconduct, civil cases. Let me give an example. In one police misconduct case, my client was a middle-aged African-American industrial worker who was coming out of his house with his lunchbox at 5:30 in the morning on North Charleston on his way to work, when suddenly his house was surrounded by 3 squad cars and floodlights, and he stood with his hands in the air with loaded shotguns pointed at him for 10 minutes while the police ran his ID. The reason was that his car matched the description of one which had been used in an armed robbery the day before, a few miles away, including a dent on the driver's side. When I brought the case in federal court, the white judge, who was on the bench because his father had been Speaker of the House, mused to me, quote, "I don't know what your client is so upset about. A couple of years ago, Senator Hollings and I were on the way to an event at Sea Pines Plantation in Hilton Head, and the guard at the gate kept us waiting in our limousine for 5 minutes so he could ascertain who we were. We didn't like it, but we realized he was doing it for everybody's good." To equate waiting in your limousine for a few minutes with standing in your driveway at 5:30 in the morning with shotguns pointed at your head is a breathtaking lack of understanding of the reality of black lives. Soon after that session with the judge, we settled the case for a few dollars, but that remark still sticks with me as an emblem of the social distance we are from each other. as one who has won, lost, and settled police misconduct cases. I know that each case does have its own facts, and I also know that how those facts are viewed will be based on the life experiences of those viewing them. When we're comparing many cases brought to us by the media, we will connect the dots between these cases based to some extent on the facts as presented, but to some extent based on our own social location. A lot of people in the Ferguson case, the protesters picked up the hands up, don't shoot logo, and then it turned out that the only witness who said that Brown had his hands up was the least credible, and that the credible witnesses all said something else, so that failed the evidence test. And I will say also that how these things work their way out in court is often very complex. May not get to anybody's idea of perfect justice. If you work in the courts all day, you realize most litigants walk away disappointed from almost any result, feeling that they haven't gotten everything they wanted, or that complete justice often eludes people. But I was interested to read that Garner's family, in the Staten Island case, did get, I think, $5.3 million from the city of New York in a civil settlement. But then, in late June, things took a different turn. These cases, which have engendered the fractious conversation about race in the past year, all involve lethal violence by police officers against African American citizens. In June 17th of this year, an event took place which does not fit all of the patterns of these actions, but which has nevertheless been absorbed into the ongoing conversation about race. As we all know, on the evening of Wednesday, June 17th, a young white man named Dylan, looks like Ruth as you write it, but the family name is pronounced Ruff. Dylan Ruff entered Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, SC, a historic rallying place for the black community of Charleston for centuries, where a Bible study meeting was in progress. He was welcomed in and sat with the study group for about an hour before he took out a gun and started shooting. As he went about his murderous work, he made clear that he was shooting these people because they were black. And he said he hoped a race war would start out of this. He killed 9 people, including the pastor of the church, who was also a popular state senator, then left. He was soon taken into custody in North Carolina. In contrast to the police cases, here there was blatant racism as the motive for violence. After his arrest, it surfaced that Ruff had been flirting with white supremacist ideas for some time. A picture on social media showed him posing in a jacket with the flag of apartheid South Africa sewn on, and posing beside his car, which had Confederate flag license plates. He had written a manifesto on a social media page. The outpouring of grief and shock from black and white in Charleston was immediate and genuine. People felt that he had been attacking the city. Suddenly the phrase Black Lives Matter took on a different cast. The actions and words of the public made quite clear that these black lives mattered very much, now that they had been so violently ended. Then at Ruff's first court appearance, something totally unexpected and amazing happened. The Bible lesson being taught at Mother Emanuel on that Wednesday night was Mark 4:16-20, the parable of the sower and the seeds. Some of the seeds fell on rocky ground and did not grow. Some were choked by weeds, and yet some fell on fertile ground and grew and blossomed. Jesus intended for the seeds to represent his teachings, the most important of which had to do with loving your enemies and praying for those who persecute you, as we heard in the reading I did earlier. This most important, most difficult, most precious seed fell on fertile ground among the congregation at Mother Emanuel. For at the first court appearance of the shooting suspects, the nearest kinfolk of the people he murdered offered forgiveness. This actual following of the clear teachings of Jesus of Nazareth is so unusual in this America, which some claim to be a Christian country, that it made the lead story in the New York Times the next morning, from which I quote. "You took something very precious away from me," said Nadine Collier, daughter of 70-year-old Ethel Lance, her voice rising in anguish. "I will never talk to her again. I will never be able to hold her again. But I forgive you and have mercy on your soul." Some seeds fall on rocky ground, some are choked by weeds, but some fall on fertile ground. The words of forgiveness held out hope that we can break out of the cycle of retribution and recrimination. We can realize that God sends his rain to fall on the just and the unjust, that we are all children of God. This spirit was identified by President Obama in his eulogy the following week. It was grace. In the face of evil and oppression, the families of the victims found forgiveness in their hearts. This did not even the score, nor did it undo the damage. But it said loudly and clearly that they who suffered the most intimate harm in this were not going to be part of promulgating further hatred. And the white power structure responded. Suddenly, an equivalent gesture was called for on the white side, and the obvious candidate was the Confederate flag. The Confederate flag had been a bone of contention for years, symbol not only of secession in the 1850s, but of segregation in the 1950s, and it now had to be acknowledged of racism. The flag was an offense to the black citizens of South Carolina and to many whites as well. I did my part when I lived there, trying to get them to take it down, though I am the descendant of slaveholders and Confederate veterans. It had become clear that while Ruff was a clearly disturbed individual, he didn't come up with his ideas entirely on his own. There was a culture of white supremacy in the state and in the nation which supported him, and that culture was represented by that flag. In the age of social media, the tired old claim that the flag stood for heritage, not hate, would no longer fly. The original documents of the Confederacy, available at the click of a mouse, show beyond question that it was created in an effort to preserve slavery, and that the moral foundation of slavery was a belief in white supremacy and black inferiority. After the Emanuel shooting, the public was swiftly reminded of these facts, and the Tea Party politicians who dominate South Carolina politics, whose political base rests heavily on flag supporters, were going to have to choose between continued defense of a symbol whose raw racist meaning had now been laid bare, or renounce it and risk alienating a good part of their constituents. Two of the three most powerful officials faced with this decision, ironically, are people of color. Governor Nikki Haley, the daughter of Sikh immigrants from India, and African-American U.S. Senator Tim Scott from Charleston. I've had little good opinion of Governor Haley during her tenure, but I have to give her credit for rising to her duty and seeing it through to the end. When the flag came down, it felt like a new day in my native state and in America. Yes, it's symbolic. It didn't put food on anyone's table. But the symbolism is about values deeply felt and lies and self-deceptions which have been told for generations. Dare we hope that some eyes have now been opened. In his Charleston eulogy, President Obama called racism America's original sin. The label fits in a sense. Color consciousness has existed throughout history, but the American idea of white supremacy was specifically crafted to provide a moral justification for chattel slavery. You can only treat humans as beasts by theorizing that they are beasts. At the same time, The idea of original sin as it was developed by St. Augustine and refined by John Calvin is an aspect of Christian theology I reject wholeheartedly, as did our religious ancestors in the Unitarian and Universalist movements. I cannot square the idea of a loving God with a scheme of justice which would condemn the entire human race, including newborn babies, to endless punishment down through the ages because the mythical Adam and Eve once ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which they've been told not to do. Racism is indeed a curse on us, upon all of us, of whatever color or condition. But it does not proceed from heaven or hell or any supernatural source. It is a result of decisions made by our ancestors 2 or 3 centuries ago, the wrongness of which have never been acknowledged fully by their descendants. The next of kin of the Charleston Nine offered forgiveness to the one deranged and overt racist who killed their loved ones. The lowering of the Confederate flag was a symbolic expiation of the long slavery and of the segregation fight. But we will not be able to move forward unless and until whites generally acknowledge and accept their responsibility for perpetrating racism in the here and now. Yes, we have witnessed a moment of grace in the matter of race. President Obama urges us not to go back to business as usual, but to seize this transforming moment. Maybe we don't deserve it, but classically that's the nature of grace anyway. It falls on us like the rain. I want to close with a story about grace. There was a slave woman in Tennessee in the 1840s named Sarah Hannah Shepherd. She had a husband and an infant child. The husband had made enough money to buy his own freedom for $1,500, and then worked some more to raise the money to buy Sarah's freedom. But Sarah's mistress reneged on her promise to sell Sarah her freedom, and announced they were moving from Tennessee to Mississippi. Sarah was determined that she would kill herself and her infant child rather than allow either of them to remain enslaved. As she was approaching the Cumberland River, she met an older black woman who sensed what she was intending to do and told her, "Don't you do it, honey. Wait. Let the chariot of the Lord swing low. Listen, I will read one of the Lord's scrolls to you. There's great work for this baby to do. She's going to stand before kings and queens. Don't you do it, honey." Chariot was the word that farm people used for a certain farm implement. Chariot would also be a way that you could maybe get from one farm to the other and maybe make your escape to freedom. Sarah took her child home, and the child lived, and eventually mother and daughter were reunited in freedom. And the child, Ella Shepherd Moore, grew up with musical talent and helped found the Fisk Jubilee Singers, which raised money for Fisk University by performing in concerts all over the world, including for kings and queens in Europe. And Ella introduced them into the Fisk Jubilee repertoire, the song her mother had taught her after she had turned away from her plan to kill them both. Swing low, sweet chariot. This is one way that grace has been working through our lives, even in the most trying of circumstances. All lives do matter, but all lives are not at issue. What the country needs is for its white population to say is that black lives matter, and then to act accordingly. We have begun to do that. Amen. Swing low, sweet chariot, come for the carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, come for the carry me home.
Our Redeemer,